Okay, members, welcome to this week's Committee for Communities. In the room with me today, I have Andy Allen. On Starleaf, we have the Vice Chair, Kelly Armstrong, we have Karen Mullen, Fran McCann, and Sinead Innes. You're all very welcome to the meeting today. I'll move on to agenda item 1, which is apologies. I have an apology from Alex Easton. Any other apologies? No, none at this stage. I'll move on then to agenda item 2, which is chairperson's business. Members, you'll recall that we agreed to seek information on what work the Committee for Health and Education, the Committees for Health and Education had done recently regarding physical activity in schools and links to health outcomes. Members, you've been provided a page 5 with 2 papers from RAISE, one on physical activity and the well-being of children and young people, and another summarising some of the evidence on the links between physical activity in schools and health and the economy in the longer term. These papers were prepared by RAISE towards the end of 2020 for the Education Committee, and now they've been shared with us. Members, are you content to note these papers for now? Requests have been sent to the Education Committee for more information on the subject. Is that okay for now? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, that's grand. I'll move on then to agenda item 3, which is draft minutes. You'll find draft minutes for the 3rd of June 2021 at page 39 of your meeting pack. Can I ask members, are you content with the minutes as drafted?
Yeah. Yes.
Good stuff, thank you. We'll move on then to agenda item 4, which is matters arising. Members, you've been provided a page 47 with a departmental response in relation to neighbourhood renewal. At our meeting on the 13th of May, we agreed to write to the department on this matter and requested information on progress around the gap in regeneration funding for towns with a population between 2,500 and 5,000. The response advises that this falls outside the remit of neighbourhood renewal and within the responsibility of officials in housing, urban regeneration and local government. However, the department is currently in discussions with DAERA and DFI on developing a more collaborative approach to the regeneration for smaller settlements. No commitments can be made until this work is complete, and no decisions have been taken in relation to funding any applications submitted to the department. We also asked for a written briefing on neighbourhood renewal outcomes, and this is provided at Annex A. Departmental officials will attend the committee meeting on the 17th of June, so that's next week, to discuss this further. So can I ask members content to note that at present, or have they any comments?
Content to note. Yeah. Sure.
Go ahead, Fra.
Sure.
Go ahead, Fra.
As I say, obviously, where people that live in settlements over 5,000 are lucky to be able to tap into neighbourhood renewal, have seen the benefits over the years. And I always thought, and I remember this difficulty coming up before, that were settlements under 2,500 or 5,000, that there was difficulties. But I did always think that DAERA or whatever had an equivalent package there to deal with social deprivation and how. And is there any way that we can find out if there are any equivalent pieces of legislation that allows social deprivation and other aspects of need in those areas? I know that when we think of neighbourhood renewal, we often think of the department for communities or in the past social development, but we'd be just interested to see if there is anything there that allows communities in smaller and catchment areas to tap into it.
Yeah, I do know, Fra, that DAERA do give money to the department for communities to roll out various programmes within those more rural areas. I do know that happens, and they have said that they are in discussions at the minute, and they will come back to us whenever that work is completed. But I mean, we can go and ask, just what money they do put into communities again. I know we did that. That was maybe while you weren't with us for that period. Because I know for definite that there is money that they give to the Department of Communities for some stuff. Kelly, you wanted to come in?
I was, yeah. To be honest, this is just something that's happening, just for clarification, Fra, that it falls between two stools. You're absolutely right, there is money provided for settlements under 2,500. The issue has arisen because previous Communities Minister Paul Given had announced that those settlements that fall between 2,500 and 5,000 could apply through communities for regeneration, and applications have been sent in on that basis. Now the Minister has said actually that's not the case. Our regeneration is for 5,000 and over. So we now have a growth in what would have been previously under DAERA, rural settlements of under 2,500, whose population has grown beyond that amount, and they're sitting in limbo with nothing. I have it with Portaferry that had applied for a huge amount of regeneration work through the council, a lot of money spent on that application process and getting plans in place. And Portaferry is not the only place, there are others across the area. So at the moment, those settlements between 2,500 and 5,000 are falling between two stools, but they were led to believe that it was coming under communities. That isn't the case. So they're not being funded in any way, shape or form at the moment for regeneration because they don't match DAERA and they don't match communities. So they're in between. So I'm delighted to see that we have folk coming to see us on the 17th because they might be able to update us. I do know that our Minister and DAERA have been talking about this issue and are trying to get something resolved on this matter. So I know there's plans in place, but unfortunately there is a case now where there's settlements that do fall between two stools, and it's important that we don't forget those growing rural areas, and they are all larger rural towns, but unfortunately they're just not being met by anybody at the moment.
No, and we do have that briefing next week, and I suppose if we can get any information at all for committee before that briefing of any of the money that does come from DAERA to the Department of Communities for that is used in rural settings. So if we can get that information before next week as well, and then that'll help us as well with our questioning of the department around neighbourhood renewal too. Is that okay?
Sorry,
Go ahead, Mark.
sorry, Chair. I just think this response is pretty poor, to be honest, and that's me being polite about it. It's just a very general and broad letter. Now, I'm not looking for analysis of every project and all the data to go with that, but there's absolutely nothing in this response or in the annex, and I think we should at least be furnished with a lot of that statistical data in advance of the oral briefing next week. I don't know what questions you can ask based on this. It certainly doesn't answer any questions, but there's not much you can ask around it either.
No, we can ask for that, Mark, and before the briefing next week, I'd like to think that they will send us a written briefing before that with some more information in, but we can certainly ask for those facts and figures as well. Any other comments? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Chair. Bear in mind, this is a written briefing that we have asked them for, and it's poetic.
Okay, well, we can pass that back. Absolutely, your point is well made. Any other comments on this before we move on?
I think I've just changed. I think you made the claim against.
Okay, you can hear somebody talking in the background. Just remember, you are all live at the minute. I'm going to move on then to next item on this, which is page 51, which is a departmental response in relation to civil service recruitment. Members, you remember we wrote to the department after our meeting on the 13th of May, seeking an update on the recruitment of staff to deal with the increased volumes of people claiming universal credit. The response states that the recruitment of 900 additional staff is already underway and will continue on a phased basis throughout the year. To date, 367 new staff have been recruited into universal credit, and a further 158 are currently going through the offer and pre-appointment stages. Recruitment and training will continue on an ongoing basis throughout 2021-2022 to fill vacancies in a range of grades. This will include intake from the NICS-wide Executive Office competitions that launched in recent weeks, with supply of these staff expected from late summer, early autumn. So members, again, any comments or content to note?
Content to note.
Okay, thank you. Then can I ask you to turn to page 52 where you'll see a departmental response in relation to amendments to NI social security legislation due to introduction of child disability payment by the Scottish Government. Following our meeting on the 13th of May, we requested a comparison between the legislative changes for child disability payment in Scotland and current legislation here in Northern Ireland. The reply states that in relation to the devolved disability benefits, nothing has been introduced or is operational in Scotland at this point. To date, the work undertaken by the Department in relation to Scotland has been to identify any potential issues for customers as a result of the changes being brought forward in Scotland, with the aim to ensure a as consistent an approach as possible and minimum disruption for any customers moving between here and Scotland and vice versa. Those legislative amendments are considered necessary and beneficial. Again, members, any comments or content to note? Content?
Content, yeah.
Okay, members, with your agreement, I propose that we now move into closed session to be briefed on the draft Charities Bill. Members agreed?
Agreed.
Great, thank you. We're going into closed session. Right, members, we're going to move on to agenda item 6, which is a departmental briefing on the June monitoring round. Members, you'll find the papers for this in your tabled items. Can I then welcome to the meeting Gavin, Patrick and Cherry Arnold? Then can I ask Antoinette if she'd move all the members down into the audience? And then, Gavin, is it yourself then that's going to kick off for us?
It's Cherry this time.
It's Cherry this time. Just do this to confuse us. Cherry, very welcome. Go ahead.
Good morning, Chair and Committee. Thank you for the opportunity for myself and my colleague Gavin to brief you today on the Department's 2021-22 June monitoring round position. In-year monitoring rounds provide departments with a formal system to review spending plans and priorities for the current financial year and provide departments with the opportunity to register any pressures or easements against budget allocations. We have provided a written briefing which sets out the Department's June monitoring round position. June monitoring was commissioned by Department of Finance on the 24th of May with a submission date of the 4th of June, the outcome of which is subject to executive agreement. In terms of the monitoring round, the Department has submitted bids totalling 58.5 million. This includes 3.6 million of resource DEL, 26.6 million of capital DEL, 8 million of financial transactions capital, and 20.3 million of COVID bids. In terms of the Department's resource bids of 3.6 million, this includes 1.5 million for housing executive to progress housing transformation and a fundamental review of social housing allocations, 1.3 million for housing executive homeless programmes, 600,000 to match fund language body funding, and 175k to progress a child funeral fund in line with New Decade New Approach commitments. In terms of capital, the Department has submitted 26.6 million of bids. This includes 18.3 million of overcommitments previously notified against our opening budget and an additional 3.8 million of new bids. The new bids include 3 million for housing executive renovation grants, 2 million for housing executive urban renewal works, 1.2 million for housing executive decent homes improvement works, and 1.2 million for the appeal service replacement IT, and an additional 1 million to support refurbishment of Oma Library. In terms of financial transactions capital, the Department has submitted a bid of 8 million. This is to support an over 55s shared ownership pilot scheme proposed by the Northern Ireland Co-ownership Housing Association. In terms of COVID, the Department has submitted 68.6 million of bids. in the executive's May COVID exercise and was awarded 50.3 million of allocations for COVID, which will be formalised in June monitoring. Whilst the 50.3 million of additional COVID funding is welcomed, there remains 18.3 million of COVID bids not met. The bids not met include requirements for local councils, charities and social enterprise and sports, and these unmet bids will be resubmitted as part of June monitoring. An additional bid of 2 million has also been submitted to help manage and clear a backlog of appeals due to the impact of the pandemic on appeals hearings last year. Furthermore, we have advised the Department of Finance of a further potential in-year bid to support culture, arts and heritage sectors given the impacts of COVID. Minister has established a cultural arts and heritage task force to advise on reopening, immediate financial support needs and on the development of long-term sectoral strategy. The task force is undertaken for further work to refine the assessment of needs in these sectors. In terms of reduced requirements or surrenders, in the monitoring round, the Department has notified Department of Finance of a 6.5 million ring-fenced resource reduced requirement in relation to welfare reform staff costs. This reduced requirement is due to delays in recruitment to fill staff vacancies in welfare reform. NICS-wide recruitment competitions for the staff at key management grades, EOT, EO2 and EO1 were launched in May. And whilst the recruitment is welcomed by the Department, there is presently no supply available at these grades. Supply from competitions is not expected until late summer, early autumn. Additionally, the Department has notified an 18 million non-ring-fenced capital reduced requirement in respect of casement. 20 million was earmarked for casement park project as part of the Department's opening budget. This was based on an early forecast of expenditure. However, current estimates are that the full 20 million cannot be spent in the current financial year. The planning approval process for the project has not completed, and there's potential conditions contained within the Section 76 planning agreement which could impact on potential costs. In completing the monitoring round, we have sought to ensure that the Department is in a position to live within strict financial tolerances and that appropriate funding is in place to meet business needs this financial year. At this early stage of the year, our requirements are based on the best information available. However, due to the nature of our operating environment and significant uncertainties from COVID and the resultant impacts on the wider economy, the Department's requirements are liable to change. As such, the Department has used the opportunity of the monitoring round to reposition its budget as best it can. I hope you found our briefing today informative, and Gavin and I are happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Cherry, for that. I'm just going to start off with a question that's not strictly related to the monitoring round, and it's something that we'll be considering later in our correspondence. So if you don't have the information, that's fine. But we've been recommended by the Finance Committee to query the rationale for any resource or capital end-of-year surges in spending. Do you know, are there any within DFC that you'd like to take the opportunity to highlight with us now? As I said, if you don't have that information, that's fair enough. It's just something that's in our correspondence later. So it's just the end-of-year surges in spending. Is there any that have been identified yet?
There were no surges that I can think of at the moment on spend that weren't part of our original plan, and obviously there's some plans to spend at the end of year on capital, but like I say, they were part of our forecast.
Okay, that's fair enough. That's all right. Then I'll just move on then to the regard to the 50.3 million COVID allocation, and you'd said there about the 18.3 million of bids not met, and you're hoping that that will be resubmitted during the June monitoring. How hopeful are we with that? because it's certainly looking at the, the 7 million for councils and the 5 million for charities and social enterprises, that will have a major impact on both of those parts of with reduced funding. So just any, how hopeful are you?
Well, obviously these will be considered against other priorities by the executive. I suppose with the likes of council and charities, we have received some funding for those in part of the allocation in May. So councils received 10 million and charities and social enterprise received 5, and work's ongoing as to how that can be allocated to the sector. So I suppose at this stage it's unknown how our bids will be prioritised by the executive. A significant amount of the funding was given out as part of the May exercise, so there isn't a large amount remaining.
And I suppose, it's positive that will be resubmitted. So, it's good that is going to happen. I just want to move on to the culture, arts and heritage stuff. And we know, and that's very welcome as well. Any money that goes towards that to, kickstarting that cultural economy. We know that they have, suffered great losses during the whole COVID pandemic. But just to ask you, if any indications as to what size of further bids that might be required in that regard?
We haven't at the moment. The task force has met, and I gave them a short briefing just on the budget position and how we go around to bid for further funding. But I'm aware that they're continuing to meet to try and quantify any potential further need within the sector. Yeah. On top of the 13 million that's already been allocated. Yeah,
because it is something that we've heard from them on many occasions, and just how much they are suffering. So hopefully we will get some good news out of the executive today for further easements, which will help with that as well. I just want to finally ask around the disabled adaptations. This is something again that has been brought up in the committee, and we all know as constituency MLAs, the amount of queries and the amount of concern that we have around disabled adaptations and the renovation grants. Again, if these bids are not met, how are we going to square that circle?
I'll be more confident on the capital bids being met. We're aware that there is an amount of money being held at the centre by DOF for allocation and due monitoring, around about 70 million, plus the easement that we've now given back in the ring-fenced amount encasement. So I'd be confident of those bids being met.
Okay, no, well that's good. That will give some comfort.
I should say obviously it is for the executive to make that decision, but I suppose that's my feeling.
No, well that's good, and if that is your feeling, I would trust your feeling on that. That's hopeful. Okay, members, if members want to ask some questions, can you please put your hands up? I have Karen and then I have Kelly. So could we bring in Karen first, please?
Thank you, Gavin and Cherry, for your presentation this morning, and very much welcome the bids going forward, in particular the ones around the housing transformation and homeless strategy work. But I wanted to ask around, and you hadn't touched on it, was the bid that's on there for the employment practices for the voluntary and community sector. Firstly, I want to declare an interest. My husband works in the sector and I worked in it for many years, and as we know, for over 10 years, more than 10 years now, workers particularly in neighbourhood renewal and supporting people have not only not had an uplift, but they have not had any increase in terms of cost of living. I know the Minister is very aware and sympathetic to that and working towards it, and hopefully this bid will be passed. But could you give us just a wee bit of detail on what that bid would entail?
Okay, so the bid is to support organisations funded through a range of voluntary and community sector programmes administered by the department, and that would include neighbourhood renewal, community investment fund and volunteering, who have been at the forefront of the front line during COVID. And as you've noted, budget limitations in recent years have inhibited any salary uplifts for the posts that are supported by those. So the bid for funding is really to look at providing an uplift to those organisations for their staff. Going forward, it would obviously be an ongoing cost as well, which would need to be taken account of. And we have bid for this as part of the COVID bids because of the frontline support that these organisations have done in the past year or so.
Thank you, Gavin. I understand the difficulties, particularly this year. The Minister had hoped that it wouldn't be a 1 year flatline budget, so understand in relation to taking those factors in. And I hope, as I say, that the bid is passed and that this is the start of addressing the pay and conditions for workers in that sector. So thank you, Gavin, for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Karen. Can we bring in the Kelly and then we'll have Robin? So Kelly.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Chair and Gavin. I have a couple of questions. Some of them may not be for yourselves to answer, but we can maybe ask questions through the dialogue to get details. Like, for instance, the first one I have on the resource bids, the NDNA Child Funeral Fund. I would very much appreciate the detail of how that is applied and who it applies to. So perhaps I know that you have the figures in there and they're very welcome, but it's more the detail of how that spend will be able to be accessed and very sadly the children that it can be accessed for. So if we could get that. On the homelessness, I hope we get this money through. I'm very aware that a number of the homelessness charities that are funded directly or to be honest through the Housing Executive received money for their first quarter but haven't received any letters of offers so far. Are we convinced, April, May, June, so we're coming to the end of the first quarter now, when will the decisions be coming forward to let the Housing Executive or whoever's paying out this money to the homelessness sector know that they can release letters of offer? I'm just very aware that we've already seen some redundancies happening within the sector, and any delays takes away that confidence from that area. So it's just when you think that this decision will be taken. I know it might be how long is a piece of string. The language body, the match funding that's coming through from that. Again, this is one about the detail of what that money is going to be used for. Given that there's a debate coming up in the chamber very shortly, it would be useful to know what that money's planned to do. So again, that's detail of the plans. Like the Chair, disabled adaptations and on the capital bids, it's the disabled adaptations and the renovation grants. I do have concerns, and I sincerely hope that that money is allocated, because if it's not, then we have an issue, an equality issue of how people can live in their home, whether it's a private or a social housing or housing executive house, if those adaptations are not permitted. I just wanted to check as well, the NIAPS system replacement, the money that's being applied for is capital, not resource. So it's just clarification on what those system replacement is. Is this just computer systems, or is it anything to do with the appeals system using alternative venues? Because that would be revenue, surely. Just for clarification on that one. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is my last question, I know I'm asking for information and asking you guys questions. I don't see in this, and there hasn't been anything in the budget about a forward work plan money that is for the department to consider work being done on the end of EU monies or EU grants and the potential limitations of the Shared Prosperity Fund. I'm just very concerned that we're still funding what we have always funded, and that's wonderful. And we know it's a 1 year budget and nobody wants that. We would love multi-year budgets, but that's not for you guys to fight that. It's for us and the Minister to fight with Treasury. But I'm just very worried, is there capacity in this year for the department to have the resource budget to think further and in the future about what's going to happen whenever the EU grants end and the alternatives to shared prosperity fund is coming forward, because that seems to be a more prescriptive fund as opposed to the way that we've been able to apply and adapt European grants. I'm just wondering, there doesn't seem to be anything in the resource, Dale, for that. And that's me.
Okay, Chair. I suppose, Chair, if I take the first question on child funeral fund, the department submitted a bid for 175,000. Obviously, it'll take a period of time to put a scheme in place. That scheme would be intended for under 18s within Northern Ireland. At this current point in time, as an interim measure, local councils are waiving. Some local councils are waiving certain fees in relation to the burial or cremation of a child under the age of 18, and that's to help ease the financial burden on parents. We're happy to bring back further details in relation to that scheme, although it still will need to be developed within the department if our bid is successful. I guess just to touch on the one too you mentioned about further work in relation to EU. There's work stream ongoing within the department in relation to EU funding going forward, replacement EU funding going forward, and we will be submitting bids as we have the opportunity to do so within the department.
Okay.
Cherry, just on that child funeral fund, if I can come back in on that one. The reason why I'm asking it is a very sad reason. At a time when a family has lost a child, it's horrendous enough for them. I would just love our specification to ensure that we're very clear when we talk about, of course, children under the age of 18, whether or not that does provide funding for someone who's had a miscarriage and is able to have a funeral or stillbirths. And I know that's a very specific piece, and I apologise if that upsets anyone, but it would be really good to have that clarified in advance, so it helps councils and families to know the clarification on that. But delighted to hear about the EU funding work stream. We can maybe ask for an update on that, Chair, at some stage.
Yeah, can. Go ahead.
Okay, if I just pick up on the other points then, on the homelessness, I don't have the direct information as to when letters of offer would actually issue, but the bid that's being put forward is additional funding, so we do already have funding within the department. For example, there was the COVID funding that we received as well on top of the normal allocations. We can, certain colleagues, we can come back on when letters of offer would actually issue. In relation to the language body, our colleagues who part fund the language body had increased the funding back at the end of 2020. So the bid that we're putting forward then is to provide that match funding. Again, I don't have the exact details of how that money is going to be spent across the language body, but the initial bid is to make sure that we're providing our element of the match funding for the language body. On disabled adoptions and renovations, as I said, I'm aware there is capital funding at the centre, so I'm hopeful on that those bids were part of our over planning in the department, so it isn't that we haven't taken that work forward. We've worked on the basis that either between bids or easements that we'll be able to cover that, so that work's taken forward. On the NIOPS, it is capital. It's for software and computer upgrades, which was due to happen anyway, as opposed to the new sites that were being created. I think that's all of the points I've been able to cover.
Thank you very much, folks. I don't envy you. I know that budget this year is testing, and I really do appreciate the work that yourselves in finance and others are doing in this matter, because it's a tough year, and I think we all recognise that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. If we could bring in Robin then, please.
Chair, can I thank the officers for being with us today. I've just one short question. It may well be that it's my misunderstanding of things. can I just ask you, query? Is there anything in here that we're bidding for NIHE around the tower block strategy and because we've now started the process of residents moving out of the tower blocks with the potential of demolition?
So my understanding is the tower blocks would fall under the landlord side of the housing executive, which and they have their own funding through the rents received and the reserves that have been built up. So it wouldn't be something that we'd bid for directly as a department.
Okay. What's this? Okay. Confused. I have to say that I wouldn't have thought that would have been landlord, but anyway, that was my.
I can come back on that. Sorry, that was my understanding. So I can double check on that, and we can come back to you to confirm the position on that. But that would be my understanding.
Okay. Yeah. Well, if you could, because obviously over the next number of months, and it is going to be a very topical issue and a major cost, I would have imagined, as the months roll by. So if you could do that, I would be grateful. Thanks. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Robin. I have Mark and then I have Andy, so if we could bring Mark in.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Gavin and Sherry for the briefing, as always. Most of the points have been raised, so I'm going to ask about something that's not on it, if you bear with me, but it's just a concern I have, and it's around the 42 million that was passed in the budget for the welfare mitigation loopholes, or the closure of them. As the legislation hasn't come through yet, and so therefore hasn't been enacted, is there a danger that, if not in this monitoring round clearly, but that money will have to be surrendered in a future monitoring round if we're not able to spend it on that?
Mark, I'll take that question. I guess in the absence of legislation, the department continues to make payments against the budget allocation, relying on the sole authority of the Budget Act. So people are still receiving mitigation payments. Obviously, in relation to the loopholes, the department was allocated funding to close the loopholes in its opening budget for this financial year. There is a risk, yes, if the legislation is not progressed, there's potential for easements emerging in year.
Yeah, and then, well, I mean, we're nearly a quarter of the way through the year already, so unless there's a retrospective element included within the legislation, is it inevitable that there will be a easement or reduced requirement?
It depends at the point in time that we see the legislation coming through. Obviously, at the minute, we're forecasting for that legislation to be progressed. Obviously, we had funding, and it was only a small element of funding that's required actually to close the loopholes. However, in terms of retrospective, I haven't seen the legislation as yet. But it's obviously something from a financial perspective we would consider when the legislation becomes available, because obviously that will set payment entitlement.
Okay, no, thanks, Sherry, but I think it underlines the us as a committee, and it's not your problem or a problem of you guys making that if we don't get this legislation and get it through soon, that people in desperate need of this money aren't going to get it, and we might end up losing it altogether. Like, they might lose it, but the department might lose it too, when it would be redirected to help other vulnerable people. But thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And then bring in Andy, please.
Thanks, Chair. Just two quick points. Just on the point that Mark raised, Cherry, would we be able to get a breakdown of that? How much of the 42.8 million was for the existing mitigations? And I know you said it was only a small portion of the 42.8 was for closing the loopholes. Could we get a breakdown on that, please?
Yes, I don't have it with me to hand, but I'm happy to provide.
No worries, thanks very much. And just another quick one. I don't see anything on special rules for terminal illness. Is there any update in that area?
Obviously, Minister is still keen to bring forward special rules for terminal illness, and there's work ongoing within the department. We had submitted a bid for 2 million, and that was for 6 months funding in the current financial year. Obviously, that bid it wasn't met. We're still undertaking policy development, and we will bring forward to the executive in due course. We haven't bid at this time. There's obviously a need to have discussions with HM Treasury on the issue of funding, and obviously work's progressing within the department to see if we can bring forward and change special rules for terminal illness.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And given you bid previously for 1.95 million, why was it that there was no bid put forward on this occasion?
Because of delays in progressing the legislation, we don't expect, because there's a need for primary legislation that will be brought forward in this current financial year. And as a result, a further bid is not being submitted in the monitoring round.
So was there a feeling previously when onto the budget that we would have been in a place to, in respect to the 1.95 million? Has that changed now?
Yes, whenever we had resubmitted our opening bids for the year, and that would have been around about January time, we felt that there would have been a time period that we would have been able to bring the legislation through, and obviously because of ongoing delays and the fact that the budget hasn't been allocated to the department, that has delayed that. And now by the time we would factor in and bring forward the legislation, we don't expect we will be able to issue payments in this current financial year.
Okay, I appreciate that, Chair. That's extremely disappointing. Would we be able to write to the department and get an update on where work is on this at the moment?
Yep, absolutely, Andy, we can do.
Thanks, Cherry. Thanks, Gavin.
Okay, no other member has indicated that they want to ask anything further at this stage. So, Cherry and Gavin, can I thank you for your time with us today? And I'm sure we'll not be too long before we're speaking to you again. Oh, could you read that?
Thank you.
On the brief.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Members, then can we then ask the department to write to the committee after the ministerial June monitoring statement asking what happened, re-June monitoring and what the remaining budgetary challenges are for the department. So are members happy enough that we write and ask that, as well as the other proposals that we've had here today, yeah? Okay, happy enough? Can I then ask then we move on to agenda item 7, which is a NICVA briefing on the impact of COVID-19. Members, you'll find this at page 75 of your meeting pack. And then can I welcome to the meeting Jeff Nuttall. Jeff, you're very welcome today. Can I ask you then to go ahead and present to the committee?
Okay, thank you. Just check first whether the committee can see my slides.
Yes,
yep.
We can indeed. We can.
Okay. So thank you again for the opportunity to present the committee on the impact of COVID-19 on the voluntary community and social enterprise sector. I'm Jeff Nuttall, Head of Policy and Public Affairs for NICVA. Just a little bit of background, if those who aren't familiar with NICVA, we're the umbrella body for the voluntary community and social enterprise sector in Northern Ireland, and we have over 1,100 members. And on our database, we have over 6,100 organisations employing over 53,000 staff and over 180,000 volunteers. Just to say a few words about the services that our sector delivers, we've done a number of pieces of research into the value of the services that are delivered by the sector. In 2017, we, in the Cantor Millward Brown Omnibus survey, we included questions asking a random selection of the public about the use of those services, and 9 out of 10 people said that in the last year they had used a service by the sector, and that 1 in 8 had actually said those services were essential to their lives. And very often there are services that are not available elsewhere and are for people that are in the most need. This year we've done a further survey into the services that the sector delivers for Northern Ireland society right across a whole range of areas. And there's just a list here of some of the key areas, the top ones being health and well-being, community cohesion and relations and safety, education and tackling poverty, as well as a range of other areas. And also there are important specific services, maybe niche services such as emergency services and community transport. They're very important in certain areas. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been doing regular surveys of the sector and of our members, really since March 2020. In the briefing that we sent to the committee, a number of the key findings are outlined, and there are links to find out more detail on the individual surveys. But in the last and most recent of those surveys in November last year, the top 3 issues, and these are really consistently the top issues in all of the surveys, sustaining organisations and their activities was top of the list. And closely related to that was finance and cash flow, and then also trying to change services to meet emerging needs. So I think a lot of organisations have simultaneously had to respond to greater need in the community, but at the same time, the impact on their staff and volunteers and income has been heavily affected. In that survey as well, over a third of the organisations surveyed said that they lost service delivery, affecting over 100 beneficiaries a week. So when you multiply that across the size of the sector, that's a large amount of vital public services not being delivered. In the August 2020 survey that we did, we asked people at that point to look ahead and what they expected to happen over the next 6 and the next 12 months. And over 60% of people said that they expected their capacity to deliver services to reduce over the next 12 months. And that's obviously on top of the reduced services that they were already reporting. And over a quarter actually said that their capacity to deliver services would reduce by between a quarter and 3/4. Nearly a third said that their income they expected to fall by over 50 to 75% in the next 6 months. And in the August survey, 1 in 25 said that they thought their organisation may not survive. That figure rose to 1 in 10 in November. These are a little bit wordy, these slides, but I just wanted to give you also a flavour of some of the specific responses that organisations gave on the impacts and the way that they've been affected. So impacts on service deliveries have included issues such as being unable to deliver services because of the COVID restrictions. So, for example, home assessments for families needing an assistance dog weren't able to do those home assessments. The impacts on staff and volunteers are reported regularly. So the well-being of staff and volunteers, who again were very often under a lot of pressure, the ability of volunteers to actually volunteer is heavily affected as well. But also keeping staff safe as we sort of move through the pandemic and people were trying to return to their normal places of work and also to their normal places where they offered their services. Keeping staff both safe and motivated has been a real issue. Again, consistently impacts on the ability to fundraise. So one respondent here saying that they'd had no meaningful income beyond the end of furlough because their main income stream from delivering services they weren't able to do because they were face to face. Another thing that was reported quite regularly was the impact of funders' expectations during this period. So whilst there had been quite a lot of flexibility in some ways, people were also still experiencing the fact that they were still under pressure to spend funding by the end of the financial year as agreed in contracts that were agreed before the pandemic, and a pressure from funders to return to, in inverted commas, normal, and also to deliver outputs that were in the original bids, even though obviously the situation that we were working in was very different. Organisations also very affected by impacts on premises. and obviously the issues on infection control, etc., but also those that are perhaps trying to move premises or looking at new premises are unable to do so and we're left in limbo. Then just a little flavour as well of some of the ways in which organisations responded to the pandemic and also adapted their services. So a lot of organisations were running things like prescription runs, food deliveries, daily house calls, and on the Community NI website that NICVA hosts, we provided a space for people to post those services, and there were well over 300 services posted on that during the pandemic. A lot of people, those that were able at least, were trying to deliver their services online where they could, and using the normal platforms that we've all got used to. Also, some were developing services outdoors where they could. And people did report as well that certain services had increased demand because of the pandemic, mental health and money advice being two of them. So just finally, I wanted to highlight some of the support needs that organisations highlighted that they felt were most important during and post-COVID. These were some of the top issues. So mental health of staff and volunteers was very high. Fundraising capacity skills, obviously directly related to infection control, actual equipment and training, and digital and online skills and getting connected has really become a much bigger issue as people have realised the importance of being connected. And I think that's something that we as NICVA will be wanting to do a lot more on. And then also individuals, particular sectors have been affected in particular ways. So this was just a response from an organisation about the impact on sporting organisations who will still be affected, they say, for a considerable period of time, and that there needed to be tailored support. So just more broadly, I think the sort of approaches that the respondents were asking for, particularly in relation to how government sort of engages with the sector, the need for long-term rather than annual funding was absolutely key. Being able to look ahead, looking at funding for new technology, and also funding regimes that were not overly bureaucratic and also were genuinely covering the costs that organisations face. So full cost recovery is an issue that's come up a lot and continues to be an issue that is of concern. And also the development not only of revenue but capital funding streams, and I know that the department is looking at that at the moment and has been talking to us about capital needs of organisations. Allied to that, physical infrastructure needs I mentioned before are important, and that includes things like IT needs as well. And then finally, I think the other thing that people were keen to ensure was that there was a seat at the table for voluntary community organisations in the planning of recovery and renewal. I think things like the Emergencies Leadership Group, which brought together the department communities and people in our sector, people were very encouraged by the approach taken. There was a very flexible, responsive approach, cutting through some of the bureaucracy. And I think there's a real desire that those sort of approaches continue in the future, not just in times of emergency, but as a way of working. Just wanted to say as well that this was happening against the backdrop of other pressures on the sector, and you were discussing the budget, the difficult budget situation that we're in, and the one-year budgeting, and the bureaucracy and full cost recovery around budgeting and funding are issues that predate COVID and remain issues. and also the issues of that Brexit and the actual implementation of Brexit affecting not just businesses but also our sector in complying with new rules and also their beneficiaries and some of their staff and volunteers. And another key area really is, and this was mentioned earlier with the committee, the replacement with domestic policies and funding programmes of important European funding programmes like European Social Fund, where there is still a huge amount of uncertainty about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund and the other funds that were intended to fill the space. Just finally then, I just wanted to highlight a couple of opportunities that we see to address some of these issues, and we are trying to address them. So NICVA, in discussion with the Communities Minister, has developed what we're calling a manifesto for change, and it's really a blueprint for how we can improve and closer working between government and the voluntary community sector, and address some of the barriers that we think exist to that working as effectively as it could, and also finding ways of valuing the voice and experience of the sector in future policy. And then we're also talking to our counterparts in the south on a range of north and south issues, but in particular the shared experience of COVID has come as an important issue, and we'll be looking at sharing what has worked in relation to COVID recovery, north and south. So hopefully that gives the committee a bit of a flavour of some of the things that we've been hearing from our research on the impact of COVID on the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for your briefing with us today. I think it has been said here many times, and I'll say it again in this committee, just how grateful and thankful we are for our community and voluntary sector, for not only the work that they have done during this past horrific year of COVID, but for all of those years of work they've done. You know, as someone who worked in the health service and someone who sat in health committee for years, you know, it's just unbelievable the amount of specialties that we have out there amongst our community and voluntary sector, and they should be praised at every turn for the work that they do. I think that it is very worrying looking ahead and how we can support that sector. I think that every department within our executive needs to be worried, because this touches everywhere. This touches every one of them, and we know that the fall in income is going to have a serious impact. It's going to have an impact on service delivery, but it's also going to have an impact on staff. And I'm glad that you mentioned it there about even also the mental health of the staff as well, because quite often we forget about that. We all forget about that. We forget about all of our own personal circumstances, that of everyone that works within any sort of job within the community, that it is tough and it is hard, and you know, that's a worrying factor, is that staff morale and staff mental health. So it's just, I suppose, the first question is to ask, how is it? You know, be brutally honest with us. Have there been many staff losses? Are we looking at further staff losses if there's not some sort of serious injection put into this sector? And also then about, you talked there about many of our within that sector that are facing real financial challenges. Have you any indication of any of those within the sector that will have to face closure, and therefore those valuable services that they provide, whether that's through communities, health, justice, infrastructure, whatever that might be, how we're going to cope with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as the sort of most recent surveying was indicating that certainly when people were looking at the future, they were around about 10% were concerned about their survival. I was going to mention as well that we are currently developing survey to look at some of the actual impacts to date. So we asked people during the various stages during the pandemic what they, in some cases, jobs and certainly volunteers have been lost and were unable to volunteer, and we want to get the actual picture. I think the other difficulty has been that knowing the full picture once some of the schemes that have been implemented during the crisis, so furlough and the Communities Fund, etc., the Charities Fund. When we look at the sort of cold light of day after COVID, then and even very soon, I think we may get a clearer picture of exactly how big the impact has been. But certainly, it was having an impact last year, and the concerns for the coming 6 to 12 months were very, very strong in November.
Just on the question around morale and mental health, is there, are there policies, are there pathways there to assist all of those, whether it's paid staff or volunteers within the sector?
Yes, and actually, as part of the emergencies leadership group, there's been, specific services and support on mental health, which NICVA has been supporting, and along with other organisations like Inspire Wellbeing. So I think it was recognised by that, and resources are being made available. I think we are, beginning to talk and do events with organisations on, how we return to work, and some of that is about sort of practicalities of return to work and perhaps even new ways of working post-COVID. But I think mental health will be part of that as well. So there are services that we are signposting people to, but I think every organisation will probably have to deal. It will obviously know its own staff and volunteers and what the issues are there. So we just need to make sure that they are aware of what support's available.
No, and I suppose, you represent many organisations, as I said, with expertise in many, many areas, and you would just be able to hope that that expertise and that help is available to share across that membership as well. That they don't have to go out and look for it, that there is that support for each other within the membership of NICVA. Okay, I have a few members that have indicated they want to speak. I have Kelly, then Andy, and then Fra. So I'm going to go to Kelly first.
Thank you. I'm off mute. Thank you very much, Jeff. I'll declare an interest. I think the organisations that I worked for were probably members of NICVA for about 20 years. So I've had the joy of being helped by NICVA on so many occasions. Jeff, thank you very much for your manifesto for change. I will be pouring through that in detail because it's always better to find from the sector exactly what your solutions could be or your options that you want us to consider. But Jeff, I just wanted to tease out a couple of things for you. We had Volunteer Week last week, the 1st to the 7th of June. I am absolutely sure that all of those volunteers who didn't stop throughout the pandemic are exhausted. And as you have raised, there are some help out there, but we quite often find that volunteers and staff who work in community and voluntary sector organisations just take that moral commitment to the nth degree. And even though they could be tired or they're financially out of pocket, they always go that extra mile. They always go above and beyond the hours that they're expected to deliver. So I just want to start off by saying I absolutely recognise that, and through NICVA to all of your members, thank you very much. But what I wanted to ask you about is there a potential coming up here for erosion of organisations' objectives? And the reason why I ask that is because when I worked in the community and voluntary sector, quite often, in order to survive in times when income from fundraising wasn't possible, we had to depend even more on the grants or the contracts that we would have had. Now, we have only applied for grants and contracts where they met our objectives, but sometimes those grants and contracts, especially from government or local government, were on the peripheral of what our objectives were. And I'm just wondering, is there any concerns? I know it's not included in your presentation here, but is there anything that we need to be aware of that we could potentially be asking community and voluntary sector organisations to do work that equates to more than 50% of their business, delivering government contracts that takes them and stretches their objectives?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there is a kind of an ongoing issue, I suppose, in relation to, funding support for the sector and whether it's in any way sort of skewing the purposes of the organisations. And you mentioned the Manifesto for Change. One of the key sort of themes within that is about, addressing barriers and including that within the funding relationship. So I think there are ongoing discussions about things like social value in procurement and ensuring that contracts, are not just awarded to lowest cost or those that are able to just more efficient at bidding. And what we want to do is through the Manifesto for Change is provide a space for discussion of different models of funding. So whether it's procurement, whether it's grants, and also the other thing we're very keen to highlight is the large number of organisations that don't have funding from government, that generate their own income, and they are often the ones that can fall off the radar. And we've got anecdotal examples during COVID where they might rely on small community events to fundraise, and they would just instantly not be able to do any of those things and fall off the radar. So we're trying to improve our intelligence on those as well. But that's kind of why we wanted to look at all those things in the round, because it's not just about funding, it's the way that it's delivered can, as you say, have a big effect on how the organisations can actually use that support, and whether it changes the nature of what they do. So we're hoping that the Manifesto for Change will be an opportunity to really work through some of those issues.
I have another just couple of questions here, and they're both sort of tied into long-term funding and full cost recovery. It used to drive me to distraction when I was a director of a local charity that full cost recovery was never allowed or wasn't recognised, and to be honest, it was disgraceful. They would give it through contracts to private companies but wouldn't recognise it for the community and voluntary sector, and it meant then that there was no recognition of reserves. I actually had it where one government department required me to spend all their money and have a zero balance at the end of March, which is just ridiculous. So we were not allowed then to save up money through straight line depreciation, even, something that's allowed to replace computers. So you have community, as you have mentioned, community and voluntary sector have said throughout the pandemic the issue of access to internet and even the digital equipment that they're using, the hardware, could be very out of date. So I'm just wondering, I know that the Concordat was reviewed, and I'm very grateful for the department to work with yourselves and others about that, but I'm just wondering, is there anything else that we could be doing to ensure that all government departments, not just communities, because communities are not the only funder, that health or economy or whoever is contracting or given a grant to the community and voluntary sector recognise that full cost recovery is necessary and should be allowed. Now, they can certainly set a limit on that, but I know that 15% for administration, but is there something we could be doing for that? And then my tied-in question to that is about the long-term funding. I have a little bit of a concern, Jeff, and I would appreciate your input to this. So as we know, one-year funding is appalling. It doesn't create efficiencies. It doesn't allow organisations to plan ahead effectively that actually would save money. So when we're talking about long-term funding, what I'm not prepared to accept from any government department is that they talk about multi-year delivery, but that only year one may be actual money and the other years then are guesstimates, because that still doesn't allow a charity to plan ahead, because you still don't have any guarantee. Now, we are stuck with how Westminster pays us, and it's been 1 year at a time. But I'm just wondering, if this starts to come forward on the long-term funding, do we have enough strength within the organisations through NICVA, through your membership, to say, no, we can't do this multi-year, it's not multi-year budgets, but multi-year programmes, where the funding is only guaranteed for part of that? So just on FCR, is there anything more we can do on that? And on the long-term funding, how we can ensure that long-term funding is not long-term projects, that we can back you on that?
Okay, so on the full cost recovery, I mean, one of the sort of places where this debate has been we're trying to take it forward is through the Joint Government Voluntary Sector Forum, which over the last sort of couple of years in particular has been looking at the whole issue of and actually trying to get a picture of what it looks like across the different departments, because it does vary. And you know, we're getting different approaches to things like capping the amount of money for pensions, and that varying across departments, and then other sort of issues where it's not entirely clear, you know, if there's a consistent approach. So we actually did, through the Joint Forum, a survey of NICVA members looking at their experiences with different funders, and were able to generate quite a lot of information, which led to some discussions between the forum members and both the Department of Finance and Communities. And that work is ongoing, and the forum's had a bit of a revamp and review recently, and this is one of the themes that we're hoping to be taking forward. But I think it's very helpful that the point you made earlier about it being not just one department, that it's a range of departments, and actually, you know, we do see a variation. And one thing we wanted to do again through the manifesto for change is sort of highlight where we think there's good practice in relation to you know, covering costs, you know, having a level playing field, as you say before. I mean, our sector is delivering health and social care services alongside the private sector and a whole range of other services, but it doesn't always feel like there's a level playing field, or even level access. And you know, the COVID crisis has kind of highlighted some of that, particularly in relation to things like social enterprises, where I'm not quite sure if they're considered enterprises or not. On your second point, just on, I was just trying to remember the
long-term projects as opposed to long-term funding.
Again, I think the thing that's been quite a lot in the discussion is the different approaches. So we've got sort of some people who've are having a conversation with one department on, you know, the difficulties of a single year and whether they can, you know, what are the ways of looking ahead. I know that from my sort of former life in working in the environment sector, DERA did go through a period a few years ago of having longer term service level agreements for multi-years, and you know, developing a partnership where it could reduce the bureaucracy, and you know, that seemed like a good model, but I think as pressures hit, it was dropped. And I think there's a lot of discussion between different people in the sector with different experiences, different departments, as to what is the way of doing this. Is it, you know, you're given an offer for 3 years, but with a, you know, perhaps a review caveat, which there's bound to have to be some caveat if the Northern Ireland budget's only being done on a yearly basis. But as you say, maybe there could be more certainty around the figures, because you know, limping from year to year and limping against the backdrop of cuts. So it's not just standing still, but potentially cuts year on year, you know, we recognise is very damaging long term for people staying in the sector as well.
It's that, I suppose where I'm coming from is you know, I had to work through funding in the past that had to be black boxed. You know, a minister had to say, keep that money there for this organisation. I'm committed to funding them. It may not be, you know, spelled out clearly, so I'm going to black box that money. So I'm just wondering, it's like that, you know, as you say, you can be offered a multi-year project with 1 year actuals, and then year 2 or 3, or maybe 2 year actuals, and year 3 and 4 are up for discussion depending on how it goes. But it's what I've always been worried about with that type of approach has been where there are cuts, it's the community and voluntary sector the easiest to cut because they're always going to deliver the services because morally they're committed to doing so. And it's that unfairness, as you say, it's the fairness. You wouldn't expect a private company to do something for nothing, and you wouldn't expect a private company to subsidise government services, but the community and voluntary sector do it. And to be honest, do it with a smile on their face and do it with the best of intentions because they're so committed to people and so committed to making this place work. No, as I say, the manifesto for change, I'm quite excited by. I always love it whenever the sector comes up with solutions because it's such an innovative sector. But I know you guys are tired. You have worked through this pandemic and all I can say is thank you for this and pass back through to Seamus and Una and everybody in NICVA my absolute appreciation for your work on this and for bringing forward this blueprint because it does give us something to work forward from. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. I'm going to move then to Andy, and then we have Fran and then Karen. So Andy.
Thanks, Chair. Can I declare an interest as a charity trustee of which is a member of NICVA? And I would echo your comments as well, Chair, and thanking the sector, a sector that always has stepped up to the mark even before the pandemic, but if the pandemic has shown anything, the sector has further stepped up to the mark in providing support to our wider communities. And thanks, Jeff, for your presentation. I'll try to keep my comments concise to let other members come in. In terms of learning from the pandemic, is there any innovative learning that has come from the pandemic in terms of fundraising, perhaps? You know, you'd mentioned, obviously, traditional fundraising closed down overnight. So is there innovative learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were sort of trying to capture people responding during the pandemic in different ways. And the other thing that we do on fundraising, we do an annual survey on individual giving and fundraising from individuals. And certainly we're seeing a big rise in digital giving, and there's a strong interest in how to capture that. And I think it's only been accelerated by COVID, which has just made all forms, I suppose, of contactless and online activities much more normal. So I think we'd expect there to be more in that field, which may be useful for some. But the innovations, I suppose that a lot of them are around ways of working and working online, etc. And apart from the sort of online contactless fundraising or funding, sort of individual giving, I can't think of any others at the moment.
Yeah, no, and I suppose one of those learnings was the restrictions around online lotteries, and it's good to see the department move to rectify that. I know it's something that's been raised in the past, but the pandemic has encouraged the department to remedy that. You'd mentioned during one of your answers to the Chair about developing a further survey to perhaps get a understanding of the state of the sector currently, but in advance of that, do you have an indication as to when that might be rolled out and when we'll have the feedback from that? And also in advance of that survey being rolled out, do you have any indication of obviously the emerging threats and also the opportunities for the sector moving forward?
Well, on the first point of it, we are actually in the process of designing the survey at the moment, and we would be hoping to get that out. I would hope in the next few weeks, and we're probably going to look at the financial year April 2020 to March 2021, so to kind of make a comparison of where people were at the beginning and at the end of that financial year. So we hope to have the results in the next couple of months, or as soon as we can. Your second point, sorry, could you repeat it?
Yeah, so it was obviously we're very cognizant of threats, emerging threats, and also opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I think people obviously, there's the straightforward threats to the survival of some organisations around the loss of income. I think that the responses during COVID through things like Charities Fund have been very important, and I think, pulled back some organisations from the brink. Hopefully people will, that will limit the damage. I think opportunities, the ways of work, the way that people have seen that they can work, and they've actually developed new services in response to COVID as well. I think there are opportunities in that. Even as NICVA ourselves, we are, we kind of transferred all of our activities online. We've been doing training programs online. We kind of initially thought that training would we sort of projected that it would have to be cut back, and in fact we've ended up doing a huge amount of the normal amount of training that we would do, and I think everyone's sort of been moving together and getting used to these ways of working. But now that we have, there are big opportunities there. It makes it easier for organisations as well that don't have to travel so far and have more access. So I think there are definitely opportunities in that sort of area.
Okay, absolutely. And one of the ways NICVA moved to try to help the sector at the early outset of the pandemic was such as Grant Tracker and providing that service free. Is there any other sort of thinking around maybe the likes of Grant Tracker, conversation with the department around providing Grant Tracker to organisations as a mainstay free of charge, things like that?
I can't really say on that specifically. There's no plan at the moment to do that. Obviously, that there was a response during COVID, and we need to kind of look at what works for the future, and also I think it's a moving picture because there are a range of different services. So like a lot of things, we kind of want to take stock of what is best for the future, and so I think we're thinking about that, but I'll certainly take on board what you're saying on that, but we don't have any specific plans at the moment.
Yeah, and just finally, you'll be no doubt aware that the department have bid and received a amount of money to further support the charity sector. Has NICVA any thoughts as to how they would like to see the department roll that out in terms of a wider support package?
Yeah, I think that there were meetings, I think this week, weren't there, with a number of people in the sector on I suppose looking at initial thoughts on, the best ways of directing that. And I think probably the main thing we would say is that, it needs to be long term, it needs to be thinking about strategic support needs for the future, for a sustainable sector. And not just sort of stopgap funding of more of the same necessarily. I think we need to look at what's needed now, but also in the future, and that the funding is guided towards that. I think what we've suffered from in recent years is with the 1 year budgeting and the cuts is not really being able to look at what's working well, what should we be doing more of, and I think we're always keen to encourage there to be a really clear, transparent approach to funding what works best in delivering outcomes, and so I think that the funding should be having that in mind, that we should be guided by what outcomes we're trying to deliver over the sort of medium to long term, and not simply a stopgap for carrying forward exactly what we're doing now.
Yeah, totally, and we need to build the sustainability within the wider sector. And your presentation, Jeff, touched on in terms of government support in some areas where NICVA feel that government could better support the sector. Is there anything else that you feel that government could be doing to support the sector moving forward? Information sharing, you had mentioned the emergency leadership group. Is there any other processes or mechanisms that government can be put in place to help the sector?
Well, I think the manifesto for change that was mentioned earlier, I think the intention of that is to sort of highlight what we would see as the priorities, and we've consulted the sector on it as well, and just to kind of ensure that these are the key areas. And I mean, the main three areas that the manifesto is looking at. The first one is about improving that understanding and relationship between government and the sector, and finding different ways of actually doing that, and having a clear policy on the sector based on a real understanding. The second area is really looking at the sort of mechanics of the barriers that there are for the sector through things like the funding approaches, full cost recovery, etc., and also just compliance issues, and just reviewing, what hoops is the sector jumping through, and are they all, are they acting as a barrier? And then the other area, I think, is just getting better mechanisms to allow the sector to feed into policy making, and to not just co-design but also co-deliver solutions. So I think we're working through that, those recommendations now. We're in discussion with the department on how we might engage with the sector to really kind of work through the detail of how those things could happen. But I think a lot of it is about moving to a point where there's a better understanding mutually, I think, between the sector and government as to how we could most effectively work together and remove some of the barriers to that happening that exists at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And two final points, Chair. I often heard it being said about the co-design piece around government, and you touched on a number of times throughout your comments, Jeff, about the relationship between government and the sector. How do you feel that relationship is? Do you feel it's improved any, or where do you feel that's at?
I think, definitely a lot of people reported during COVID, positive developments in relation to the relationship, and saying that the relationship had been very good in working together in response to COVID, and I think people want to build on that. And I think there are still issues around perennial issues around bureaucracy and that are very live at the moment, and but I think there's definitely a willingness, certainly in the Department of Communities, and we really want to bring all of the departments in on that, because I think the relationships are different with different departments. I think there are different issues, so it's really helpful, I think, to bring that across the departments and look at encouraging the departments to look at the sector as a whole and have a sort of consistently supportive approach, so that there aren't a lot of different variable approaches being taken.
Okay, and so it'd be fair to say that the relationship, the working relationship has improved, but there's a way to go still.
I think there's definitely things that could be done, and I think that's what we want to do through the Manifesto for Change is, highlight some of the obstacles and look at what the best practice is and try and make that best practice more uniform. So that's really what we'd be keen to do.
Yeah, and just finally, I know you've covered an awful lot through the various questions. Is there any additional learning that you haven't touched on throughout the pandemic or even before the pandemic that can be taken forward?
Yeah, it's I suppose it's difficult because we're still sort of taking stock and knowing exactly what our ways of working will look like. I think we are beginning to work that through. So we've been running a number of events on, what we're calling blended working. So, learning lessons from different ways of working online and in person. And I think a lot of organisations in the sector are already thinking about this, and we're sharing, experiences with them. So I think it's difficult to say exactly what the lessons of that will be yet, but maybe in 6 months' time we will, if with a fair wind, we're out of the other end of the pandemic largely, and we've got the breathing space to sort of really take stock of what are the lessons, what are the things that we want to continue to do, what will work in future. We're going to work through that with the sector.
No problem at all. Thanks very much, Jeff. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Can then we bring in Fra, please? Fra, go ahead.
Sure, thank you for that. Sorry, my finger hit the wrong button there, and it cost me out into oblivion there for a couple of seconds. But I want to thank Jeff for the presentation. It's good to see the likes of NICVA, who are continuously to strategically plan for the future and what has been a difficult past year. And most of the questions that I was going to ask have been touched on. I know that Kelly touched on full cost recovery and the multi-year funding award. And I thank God that we have a minister in at present who is steeped in the community sector, understands it, appreciates the work, and will always argue their corner. But I think there's a number of things that I would like to say, and I know Jeff had touched on the likes of pensions and things like that. But there are quite a number of groups, and it was mentioned earlier on, the likes of Neighbourhood Renewal and others, that haven't got pensions to look forward. They've given a lifetime service to the community, and not that they are in it for what they can get out of it, but they have little to look forward to in terms of pensions and other things for the future. And I think it's important that we continue to focus in on that. And there are many within the community sector, and people would understand it, that still don't feel that their worth is appreciated. And one of the things that I would have to say, and all of us have touched it at committee, that at a really, really difficult time, that these people rose to the challenge of trying to make people's lives better on a very difficult occasion. And many times their very lives were at risk at the head of this pandemic, and we should never forget that, and never forget that without these people, that many people that would have relied on people getting in touch or being fed wouldn't have got that. So I just wanted to make that point. I think that there are hundreds, and I meant to say at the start, I know people come in and say that they declare an interest. I wouldn't like to declare an interest and mention all the groups that I'm a member of. It would probably take me a half an hour. So I do think that at a time when it's difficult for community structures, that what we need to do is to constantly reach out and ensure that by default, new ways of doing things, that again, many of these community groups go to the wall. And I hope that in the strategies that NICVA is working out and development at present, that it takes them into consideration. I think that's an important factor of community life at the present time. It's going to be difficult for people. It's going to be hard for people to move on. But we need to continuously slap them on the back and say, job well done. We will help you whenever, wherever, and in whatever capacity that we can. And that's my rant over for this session anyway. Jeff, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fra. Well said. I'm going to bring in Karen, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jeff, and Jeff about like Fra. Coming at the end, all the questions have been asked. You'll be glad to hear, because you've got quite a number today. But I think it just shows you, Jeff, the support that you have in relation to the committee members and how passionate we feel about it. And also, I just want to echo Fra, the Chair, and others, and put on the record our thanks to the community workers, volunteers and organisations like yourselves, not just in the pandemic, but particularly in the pandemic. I seen the work that happened within my own community. We have the Triax neighbourhood renewal area where I live, and the work that was done over particularly the pandemic, the vital services that was provided. You listed many of them today, all of those and more. When we've seen many services disappear and some have yet to come back, unfortunately, Jeff. But as I know, you are well over all of the detail. We heard it here today. So for me, it's really good to hear a bit more around the work that is happening and that you do have a seat at the Joint Government and Community Sector Forum, because I know that going forward that you will be working hard in relation to that. Because for me, it isn't just that it is vitally important that you have a seat at the table of the community and voluntary sector, but that the sector's always involved in the co-design from the very beginning and not at the end at delivery. We've seen that too much over the years, and I know particularly, Jeff, you had answered questions there around the health and social care delivering element of it. And for me, I suppose what I should have said as well, I declared interest. My husband works in the sector. I worked there for 20 years. All the points that Kelly raised around working in the sector, I went through that as well, the vulnerability and the funding. But I did see over the years, Jeff, and still see it, just that the community and voluntary sector just are at times not a valued partner. And we have many organisations in the community and voluntary sector, particularly in the health and social care element, that have been delivering and working in partnership with health and social care for possibly 30 years. These organisations have been about, so when are they going to be trusted and valued? So I commend you on the work that you are taking forward and representing them groups and moving through government on that. As Farah has said, we're lucky we have a minister who is very grounded and embedded in the community and voluntary sector and committed to the work. Unfortunately for somebody like myself and Minister Harvey, we did see a deadly pandemic that delayed a lot of the work that I know that the Minister wanted to take forward in relation to the sector. And you would have heard me speak earlier around the pay and terms and conditions, particularly for workers in the neighbourhood renewal and supporting people, but I know they're not the only ones. That has been going on for many, many years. And as Farah said, they put themselves forward. They're not even asking, and never would, for a pay increase when we see other sectors of workers mobilising. And I just think that that's a complete injustice, and we do need to look at that, because, as Farah pointed out, people then don't even have a pension at the end of this. So a lot of work that has to be done, but lucky that we have a minister that's committed and working towards it. And just on the funding, I suppose what I wanted to say, agree on all the approaches as well, Jeff. Good to see around the welcome, the key piece around the manifesto for change. And then in terms of the full cost recovery and funding model, just I was Party's education spokesperson for the last period, and EA Youth brought on a new funding model. Jeff, I'm sure you're aware of it because you're over everything. And I just thought that it was really good. It reminded me very much in terms of the lottery funding, and I know they worked very closely with them. So they've got a full cost recovery, 3-year budget with flexibility in it. And I know they're just starting out in that, and they will assess it as it goes along. But if we can do that through a government department, we certainly should be able to do it through ours. So there's a lot of learning out there, a lot of good practice, and I suppose that needs to be taken forward. But I know that that's part of the work. So just a thanks for me, and thank you today, Jeff, for taking us over and bringing us up to speed on the current issues as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. No other member has indicated that they want to come in at this stage. Jeff, I think you heard resounding appreciation from everyone in this committee, and I think you will be aware that we will continue to lobby on behalf of the sector that you represent. So could I just ask then that you take that back to your members, just how much we do appreciate, as I said, and as other members have said, not just the past year, but the many, many years of service to the various sectors within Northern Ireland. So thank you for joining us today, Jeff.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, members, we're going to move on to agenda item 8, where we have a briefing from CO3 on the impact of COVID-19. You'll find the papers for this item at page 94 of your meeting packs. And then can I welcome to the meeting Nora Smith, Richard Spratt and Michelle Janes. So Nora, how are you? Over to you.
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, Paula. So just to start with an introduction to who CO3 is. So for those that aren't aware of CO3, we're a membership-based charity. Our members operate at a senior leadership level, working across the charity and social enterprise sector, and we've just over 700 members. And I want to put on record that we welcome and thank the committee for their focus on COVID-19 and the charity sector. Today is important, both for us to reflect back, but also to look forward. And what's really important here is that we learn the right lessons from the pandemic. So I suppose it's really important to highlight that leading an organisation during COVID-19 is hard in any sector, but the lack of funds, increased demand for services and an uncertain path has made it extremely challenging for our sector. It has created the perfect storm for so many of our members, increasing the vulnerability of our most vulnerable across society, whilst challenging the ability of charities and social enterprises to respond, with some of our members experience huge drops in their income, with their funding model literally falling off the edge of the cliff. So if I may add my thanks and pay homage to our members and indeed the wider sector who have stepped up and protected and supported the most vulnerable in society over the course of the past 15 months. Our sector has demonstrated strength, it has demonstrated flexibilities, with leaders being able to step up, to quickly respond, to work collaboratively with government, forging new relationships and strengthening existing ones. And I think what's important about this pandemic is that COVID-19 has turned an overdue spotlight on the vital role that charities and social enterprises play in helping our most vulnerable in society. So through the pandemic, CO3 has been advocating and highlighting the challenges of COVID-19 on the sector. The pandemic did hit our sector hard. Everyone was impacted. However, the scale of the financial impact did vary across the sector. The full sector has been forced to adapt and change. We've all had to become tech savvy overnight and respond to changing demand by moving support services online, keeping connections to vulnerable people by making thousands of calls, involved in the delivery of food parcels, medicines, and keeping those social connections alive. And I think what's being really demonstrated is our value and worth with those strong links within communities, and that's been a critical part of the response, providing literally a lifeline and keeping people connected and healthy. So 15 months into the pandemic, and to date, no charity has had to close yet. And this was due to a number of factors. Members reduced expenditures and services to mitigate against income losses. Furlough was accessed, mothballing services as a consequence, but ultimately for the longer term protection of organisations and services they provide. And for some charities, access to the COVID-19 and the Social Enterprise Fund delivered through DFC. And of course then you had independent trusts and foundations that were able to step up, offering a range of grants as well as providing flexibility with existing grants. And the same is true of the public sector. We've seen government departments and arm's length organisations demonstrating a level of flexibility and cooperation, which has set a precedent, I think, for the future and a different way of working. Unfortunately, and we've touched upon this already in Jeff's presentation, we've seen some members having to make redundancies. In our most recent survey, which we carried out last month, 37% are already considering redundancies, and a further 40% have stated that they may have to start this over the course of the next 6 months. And of course, this has many implications, including diminishing our ability to retain talented people in the sector, the impact it has on individuals and families, and of course on key services that we provide across the sector. We have entered a new phase of the pandemic with lockdown restrictions easing, which offers hope and offers opportunities, but the uncertainty of our world still makes it really difficult to plan and to strategise. Pre-pandemic, the sector was already exposed to a range of issues and challenges. the short-term funding cuts and/or no uplifts on funding, and the funding models not based on full cost recovery, and the short-term nature of funding as well. And there was, and still is to a certain degree, lots of talk about building back better, and the pandemic has exposed our strengths, our challenges and our vulnerabilities as a sector. So today I think it's important opportunity for us to learn the right lessons from the pandemic. Ultimately, my instinct is that our sector's survival depends on it. Building back better has to represent fundamental changes. So the National Lottery Community Fund recently launched a briefing offering their insight into administering the first phase of the DFC COVID-19 fund. So if you haven't read it already, please do. It's on their website. And one of the conclusions that they had reached is that it's likely that the charity sector will fall into further financial risk. They also talked about the need for longer term funding in order to develop sustainable charities. And I listened to Jeff's presentation. He brought up similar points to what I'm just about to raise. The need to reduce bureaucracy linked to public sector funding. Red tape stifles innovation, and a more flexible approach is needed to funding if you're going to focus on the outcomes rather than on the paperwork. And of course, this is linked to changing the funding model. Short-term nature of funding, it has to change. In a recent survey of our members carried out in November, on the issue of full cost recovery, 75% of respondents stated that they're funded on an annual basis. 66% also stated that they're not funded on a full cost recovery basis, and 1/4 of those organisations have had to subsidise contracts by over 50,000. So this just isn't sustainable. So I've listed a number of recommendations in the briefing paper today. I'm not going to repeat those in the interest of saving time and giving the opportunity for Michelle and Richard to offer their insights and experiences of the pandemic as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Michelle or Richard, have you anything that you want to add at this stage yet?
Michelle, after you.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Chair. My name is Michelle James, and I'm head of Barnardo's here in Northern Ireland. You'll all know we're the largest children's charity in Northern Ireland, and each year we work with approximately 18,000 children, young people and their families right across about 45 different services and programmes. And throughout the pandemic, our services continued to operate while also adapting and responding. We've all talked about our digital offers, but responding to the new challenges that we faced. We continued to support our children and their families when they needed us more than ever. However, the pandemic's hit us hard, and the demand for our services rose, but our ability to raise funds decreased. Our shops were closed and normal fundraising activities couldn't take place, and this had a significant impact on our finances, and there are still considerable challenges ahead. Barnardo's Northern Ireland has a good relationship with the Department for Communities, and recently we participated in the Department's Access to Food Engagement event. We co-chair the Anti-Poverty Strategy co-design group with the Department, and we value the opportunity to collaborate with DFC, and we appreciate the Department's commitment to shared purpose, learning and focus on reducing vulnerability. We welcomed the COVID-19 related initiatives which mitigated some of the negative impacts of the pandemic, including the furlough scheme, the Department's VCSE recovery fund, and we were also pleased to be asked by the Department to distribute a seasonal appeal in December 2020 to children and families that needed support. Over a period of only a few weeks, we distributed £210,000 worth of food vouchers and practical support, which benefited 9,000 children and families in Northern Ireland. Therefore, we were very disappointed when we were deemed ineligible for the DFC COVID-19 Charity Fund. Our governance arrangements are appropriately robust to maintain DFC contracts. You was talked earlier about supporting people in neighbourhood renewal. And it's also appropriately robust to distribute much needed funding to vulnerable families. So it was really disheartening that our application was rejected. As we demonstrated with the seasonal appeal, we work in local communities all across Northern Ireland with some of the most vulnerable children and young people, including children with disabilities, children at risk of sexual exploitation, and children in care. we would urge the Department to reconsider the criteria for future funding so that our children and families across Northern Ireland are not left without support. I listened to Jeff talking earlier and listened to Kelly and also with what Nora said. Another major concern for us is full cost recovery. Many of our services are not contracted with full cost recovery, with the remainder being subsidised by Barnardo's Northern Ireland voluntary funds, which we raise through our shops and fundraising activities. This is unsustainable, and in the past year, this has unfortunately led to service closure, and some of you might be aware around our autism service, which was around for over 20 years, had to close. Finally, we want to highlight the benefits of longer-term commissioning, and you've flagged this, we've all talked about this. Longer contracts would encourage a more strategic use of resources and support efficiency within DFC, allowing community and voluntary sector organisations to improve services, innovate, provide continuity and stability, not only for our children and their families, but also for our staff. A move to commissioning cycles of 3 to 5 years will allow us to focus on service delivery rather than funding applications. In summary, we'd have 3 asks: that we move to full cost recovery, the default for all contracts, that there's a move to longer term commissioning cycles with a very minimum of 3 years. So that only then we'll be able to measure outcomes properly. And I would ask that we expand the eligibility criteria for the next round of funding for the charities operating in Northern Ireland, especially those on the Section 167 list. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Michelle. Richard?
Yes, thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to present and address the committee this morning. For those that don't know, Cancer Focus Northern Ireland is the longest standing local cancer charity here, working right across the cancer spectrum, leading on the important work of prevention to try and reduce the incidence of cancer and the cost of that into the future, providing patient services, supporting people practically, emotionally and psychologically, investing in groundbreaking research, and also advocating at policy level. And the last few months have been the most challenging in our 52-year history, as it has been for many organisations and colleagues across the sector. We work with thousands of families that receive the devastating news of a cancer diagnosis every year. The financial impact of COVID on our organisation has been devastating and leading to disruption of the support of those people. We, like many organisations in the sector, don't receive an appropriate level of statutory funding and historically rely, as has been mentioned in previous submissions, on voluntary income from public fundraising initiatives to fund most of our work. In our case, 85 to 90% of our portfolio work over the years. So therefore, as a consequence, the pandemic has been very serious for our organisation. In the last 15 months, we have lost in excess of 1.5 million of income between our charity retail function and community and event fundraising programmes being understandably but severely disrupted through lockdown. We're currently budgeting for our new financial year, which begins in August, and there remain high levels of uncertainty about the recovery. I would like to put on record and to acknowledge and thank the committee as a grateful recipient from both the COVID-19 charity fund rounds and also the Social Enterprise Fund. We did meet the eligibility criteria that was set and had the opportunity to apply and draw down support from these sources. And I would say, coupled with the furlough scheme, that has been a lifeline, gone some way to filling the void that has been left in our fundraising income. Otherwise, the consequences would have been catastrophic. But we have had to react, and again, speaking to many other colleagues in the sector and through the CO3 network, we have had to put in place very acute cost reduction strategies in order to deal with the context that we find ourselves in. And we have unfortunately had to embark on redundancy processes and reducing a staff team of over 100 by 15%. And obviously we've tried to minimise the disruption to our frontline services, but haven't been able to avoid some level of service reduction and disruption. And this has impacted the patients and the families that we seek to serve. And these decisions are not taken lightly, but have been necessary, and as Nora has indicated, to protect and to maintain the medium to long-term viability of what we do and what we offer. But I would have concern sectorally in terms of a general contraction and the impact on patients going forward. Just to give the committee a tangible example of one aspect of our work that has been affected and the consequential human impact, Cancer Focus Northern Ireland provides most of the psychological and emotional support of cancer patients across the 5 health trusts in a range of settings, including in hospitals, in the home and in the community. And while we have morphed this service and many of our services to a remote basis, unfortunately this has been impacted by the effects of the financial effects of COVID, due to us not receiving full cost recovery from statutory sources. And we had at one point for a period of 5 to 6 months reduced that capacity by 75%. And you can imagine in a context of increased need, heightened levels of anxiety, and the well-documented cases of patients receiving later diagnosis and disruption to treatment, the need for this service actually spiked, and the waiting times increased considerably for the counselling services during the pandemic. Finally, I just would like to concur with a lot of the comments that have been made in terms of our sector. I'm new to the sector, having been in post for 9 or 10 months, but the work of the sector is remarkable. The resilience has been demonstrated over the last few months, and the creativity and the ability to innovate and morph very, very quickly. But I would just underline what is offered being truly valued, and that actually being reflected in some of the conversations and the potential changes to funding models going forward. Whilst we're very thankful for the support that offered to date, I would just urge the committee that there does need to be provision for continued and sustained long-term funding multi-year to enable ourselves and others to plan more effectively. And again, to advocate for the mainstreaming of core services such as psycho-oncology and cancer counselling and other vital services from statutory sources. And again, I echo the comments around full cost recovery. I would like to acknowledge the 5 million that has been set aside and that will be administered in due course from the announcement that was made in May time. And again, just that the committee is aware, a lot of organisations like ourselves have had to cut their cloth, have had to make cost reductions accordingly, and going forward that the criteria is open, so that where we maybe have balanced budgets going forward, that any eligibility criteria set is not prohibitive to those organisations that have taken these steps. So thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to come and present this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Michelle and Nora for that. I suppose I'll begin with this briefing as of previous, just by just wanted to say how much we appreciate all that it has been done, not just in this past year, but in the many, many years of fulfilling a much needed services out there, and at your level of expertise that you have within those services, it cannot be matched. And I very much know the value. And I mean, much of what you're raising are issues that we have raised on many different issues, whether that's the 3-year funding and commissioning cycle. We could probably put that beside nearly everything that we do within the Communities Committee. So we absolutely, that is something that we would all agree with. I was very good, I know other members had asked it on our last presentation about lessons learned. And I think that you very much had put down some stuff here within your briefing, Nora, about lessons learned. So maybe you want to just explore that a little bit further. Also want to just, you've written here about the high levels of anxiety on staff due to increased demands for the service. Just how that you're managing that and how you're handling that, especially given that there's been an increase in demand, yet a decrease in the amount of money that's coming through. And I also know, because we're all impacted by the fact that we're having to work remotely, and working remotely has an effect on us all. When we can't be with each other, and we can't, I remember when I worked in social services, we had that sort of time on a Friday for coming out of your role and being able to offload and being able to share experiences. So it's just how have you been managing with all of that as well. But it's that lessons learned, Nora, that I probably want to touch on, whether that is, and I know you'd said here about the timing and the design of allocations on previous funding, and all but we know a lot of those allocations that have been done over the past year have had to been developed very, very fast and have to been rolled out in a timely manner as well. So it's not that I'm trying to put any blame there. It's just that on going forward, because none of us knows what lies ahead over the next year as well. Just then, how would you see a better, and I know you'd written or put in there about that whole co-design with actually yourselves as representatives of the sectors. Just a few things there.
It's just to touch on the health and wellbeing piece. It is ginormous, and it does predate the pandemic as well, though. Yeah. The sector has been stretched and pulled, and it comes back to the funding model. The basis of full cost recovery is that it doesn't support the engine room costs. So as a result, then you're trying to do more with less, and it's such a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason as well. So even before the pandemic commenced, there was a high sense of job insecurity and anxiousness, and people already feeling overworked. And then the pandemic hit, and it was just a whole new layer. So it does come down to job security. It does come down to, I think a big piece of this could be answered in relation to how the sector is fundamentally funded. And of course, the opportunity to have access to health and wellbeing services is really important, and something that lots of our members would do anyway for their staff. But whenever you're not able to offer them job security, or whenever you have to put half your staff on furlough and then the other half have to take on the responsibility of more work, it takes its toll, and it's taken its toll over many years. So I'm not sure if I've offered any solutions there, but I think it is just important to highlight that. So in relation to the lessons learned, and we're all still learning through this pandemic. And I do think, the opportunity to co-design a criteria that represents where the sector is now with this £5 million would be hugely beneficial. And I know that the DFC did consult and engage with a range of sector representatives and different members, but then they ultimately went into a room and wrote the criteria and issued it. I think there is an opportunity to do that differently, and to sit down with sector representatives, including ourselves and NICVA and others, around the table to look at, well, what is it that we need now, and what should that criteria look like? We have to be realistic as well. This is only £5 million. It's not going to touch the sides. But I don't think that should be something that DFC should necessarily worry about, because it'll only demonstrate the demand and the need to invest and build in stronger proposals to bid for more money moving forward.
Yeah, just want to also then, and probably just to ask that of that's part of Michelle as well. I note there, Nora, in your submission, you had said that when the DFC Charity Fund reopened in January 2021, we still haven't received the information on that of who was funded, and that hasn't been published, or the amounts. Is that correct?
It is correct. Now, I was speaking to an official, I was speaking to Joanna earlier this week, who was able to give me some updated stats. So she had informed me that I think there was an additional 7 million that was allocated. So the total funding to the sector allocated was just over 20 million. And I think there were approximately 700 charities that had benefited from it. And as well, just to put on record, CO3 were one of those beneficiaries as well, and we are really grateful for that support. But unfortunately, that criteria did lock out some members that did need access to it, like Barnardo's and others.
Yeah, and it's just, well, we can ask as a committee for more information around that fund on the allocations and the amounts. But just then, I know, Michelle, you're one of those charities then that their headquarters is not based here in Northern Ireland. And I know that when we got a briefing, and other members can correct me when they come in if I'm wrong, we had got a briefing on that, a few months ago, and the department were very much trying to work around that. So I take it they were unable to work around that?
Yeah, they were, Chair. They weren't able to work around it. So we lost nearly £1 million last year in terms of fundraising, and with the shops being closed. And we applied for 75,000, and the ineligible bit was that we're not registered as a charity in Northern Ireland because we're already registered in UK and in Scotland. And so we're sitting, like lots of other charities, on the combined list with the Charity Commission here, this as a Section 167 organisation. And so we're waiting, and we will, of course, register when that opportunity arrives. And I did talk to officials as well who there was some assumptions made about when money comes out from other jurisdictions that we would benefit, and that's actually not the case.
Yeah, because, I do remember the conversations here in committee around this, and how that we had highlighted that, and the committee had highlighted on the back of previous witness sessions with yourselves, and we thought that there had been some sort of room had been made there, or they'd made some sort of headway, but now you're telling us they haven't. We'll need to have to go back and ask those questions around that as well. I'm going to open up to members. Of Robin, and then of Kelly, and then Karen. So I'm going to bring Robin in first.
Thank you, Chair, and can I thank Nora, Michelle and Richard for being in attendance today, and like others, and very similar to the NICVA presentation, I think the work that you've done over the pandemic period is greatly appreciated and valued, I think by all. Not that makes any difference. I think it's valued across the communities, across folk of Northern Ireland every day of the year. I wonder, could I just pose, Nora answered a few questions there from the chair, which I had on my list. So I wonder, could you, in terms of addressing the issues that you've raised, and I've no doubt that the members of the Communities Committee will indeed be supportive of you, but in terms of how you take your message forward into the wider political context and the wider decision-making context, what is your strategy in terms of moving that forward? Can I ask that as number one, and then perhaps specifically to Michelle? Michelle, I also sit on the Education Committee, and there is a great deal of support within the Education Committee for those children, and I suppose the pandemic has highlighted the issue, those children who are at risk or in care. And indeed the difficulties that those children had in keeping up with education and support. And I do believe that there would be a mind in amongst the education members to support specific initiatives to address those children needs. And then perhaps to Richard. Richard, you mentioned the $5 million budget allocation. Maybe you could just certainly update me on the thinking of that 5 million and when access to that will become available, and maybe what criteria is perhaps being developed to make it available.
Mary, who wants to go first? Laura, do you want to go first, or Richard, or Michelle, either?
Richard, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Robin, for the question. I think at this stage, I think the funding has been announced, but my information is that there's no information as yet in terms of confirmation of the criteria. My point was just that a lot of remedial action has been taken by organisations, and I would just be cognizant that if the criteria was similar in terms of demonstrating deficit budgets and costs that were unavoidable within a particular period of time. A lot of organisations have morphed and had to adapt, and we, as an example, have worked towards a balanced budget, but that is off the back of a fairly acute cost reduction piece of work. So I would just worry that if similar criteria was applied, it could be prohibitive to more organisations. And I know Michelle has some thoughts around the criteria from the last round as well. So that was the point that I was seeking to make.
Okay, thank you, Richard.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Michelle.
It's okay. Thank you, Robin, for your question. There are extensive needs that that have been identified for a long time, specifically around children at risk or children who are looked after by the state. And the pandemic has exacerbated them. You are right, and I know we would have talked regularly with colleagues in education, whether that's at committee or within the department or within the Education Authority. And we recently contributed also to the piece on educational underachievement. I think that we've got to look at how this pandemic not only has affected specific groups of children, because I'm also thinking about young carers, but also how we sustainably work together and fund initiatives that are going to ultimately change the outcomes for all children in Northern Ireland. And I think the way that we do that is not only by working together as a sector with our partners in the statutory sector too, but also cross-government and using the legislation that exists already in terms of the Cooperation with Children's Bill to do that. I think if we pull resources together in a more effective way, in a more strategic way, we'll achieve better outcomes for all of our children. There are some initiatives that have been announced recently in relation to funding from both health and education, but I would highlight there's one significant investment that has been announced recently in education, and the funding is significant, and the voluntary and community sector are eligible to apply. However, there's no staffing costs built into those. So if you want to deliver services, new services to vulnerable children or children in communities over the summer, there's money for programmes, but there's no money for staff. And even if I could put volunteers in to lead that work, which is an option, volunteers require support, they require supervision, there are governance procedures and processes that we need to build in around them to make sure that it's safe for everybody. So it's just that there's always a bit of a, we can do this, but actually then we're not funded properly to do it. Does that answer your question, Robin?
Yeah, it does, Michelle, and I would say if you felt appropriate, I would welcome a short, I'll just call it a letter or a memo on your thoughts around that intervention type work. Yeah.
Okay, that's no bother. Thank you.
Yeah, and then Robin, just before I get to your question about the strategy for moving the issue forward, in terms of the criteria and the timescales for this new £5 million fund, we don't know what the criteria is yet. DFC it's talking to a range of partners across the community and voluntary sector. But from our perspective, what we're asking is, let's sit down in a room and design this together, so that it's more than just consulting with us and then going off and designing the criteria. And also, I think what's really important is whoever's going to be the delivery partner as well, whether that's the National Community Fund or whether it's the Community Finance Ireland, that they're part of that process as well. And the criteria has to change. We are in a completely different stage of this pandemic. And as Michelle and Richard have pointed out, they've cut their cloth accordingly. So we need to have a fund which demonstrates we're at a different point. but still in a really vulnerable position. So that opportunity to have, 5, 6, 7 heads round the table with different perspectives on this, I think would really add value and come up with a criteria pretty quickly. I would say, to enable the timescale for this to happen sooner rather than later, because I am aware, we're now hitting mid-June, and this has to be spent by March of next year, which, will be here in a flash. And in terms of the strategy for moving these issues forward, so I suppose there's different ways in which we're approaching this. So we sent the full cost recovery report to a range of different government ministers. We had a round table with the Finance Minister, Conor Murphy, about 6-7 weeks ago. And that resulted in one of our members being involved in an innovation lab through the Department of Finance about how we design public procurement policy, which ensures that full cost recovery is built into it, and as well as sitting alongside social value. But I think it's important not to confuse the two. They are different, but they are interconnected. I think there's also an education piece as well. It's about how we build our relationships across government departments and with government departments as well. So initiatives that CO3 is being involved in, that Michelle actually participated in a few years ago, was the cross-sector leadership exchange that we do with the Chief Executives Forum. So again, it's an opportunity for senior civil servants and third sector leaders to step into each other's world to build that better understanding, because we're not going to break down those barriers until we understand how our respective worlds function. And there are some similarities, but there are also huge differences, which does impact on one another. And then bringing our members together, that convening space, reaching out to the likes of yourselves at committees and bringing this important issue to the table. And we will be reconvening members again in the next couple of months, just to look at full cost recovery. We launched the report and just after Christmas. Where are we now? What progress have or haven't we made? And then what do we need to do moving forward? And it's about having seats at the right table and being invited along. So we're knocking on lots of different doors. So sometimes they're opened, sometimes it just takes a bit longer.
Okay, thank you, Nora. Chair, perhaps we as the committee, through yourself, could maybe seek clarity on the 5 million budget allocation on behalf of, to address the questions that both Richard and Nora in particular have raised today.
No, absolutely, we can certainly do that, not a problem.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Just also to inform members, the committee clerk has just informed me that the breakdown of the Charities Fund allocation will be in our pack next week, so we'll be able to see that next week. Just before we go off writing to anybody, it's going to be there next week. Okay, I'm going to move on. Thank you, Robin. Was that you finished, yeah? Yeah.
Yes, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. I'll move then on. We've got Kelly and then we've got Karen, so we'll go to Kelly.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Nora, Michelle and Richard. Richard, you've said you've been in the sector for 9 months. I bet you it feels like 9 years at this point. It is one of the most dynamic and innovative sectors that I have ever worked in. That old that I spent a long time before I joined the community and voluntary sector, and then a long time after I joined it, to compare the two. Right, so thank you all very much for the work that you're doing, but I'm going to have a few asks of you because Robin has covered some of my questions. You'd be glad to know. Michelle, Barnardo says, I worked for a 167 charity and I recognised exactly what you're talking about. Quite a lot of us that worked in 167 charities know that you have to wash your own face in the area that you're working in. So you don't have this ton of money that all of a sudden comes from England, Scotland or Wales into Northern Ireland. While there are certainly savings made by having a central finance department or HR department, that doesn't mean to say that it pays and covers for services in different jurisdictions. So I want to ask you, and Richard, this will apply to you as well. Do you have, Richard, yours is slightly different, I'll explain this in a minute, but do you have, Michelle, any outline of the impact of loss of services or loss of capacity to be able to deliver services during COVID that you have had because Northern Ireland didn't your charity didn't have access to funding because of the 167 status and the fact that that hasn't been sorted out. So that's the first one. Richard, similarly with yourselves, because of the situation with COVID, it's not so much a loss of funding because we know there was funding available, but the amount, because of the waiting lists, especially connected with cancer, how much more pressure was put on yourselves, and if you had to cost that all out, what was the cost? Or what would the cost, or what should the cost have been? So how much money were you not available, that could have delivered all that you had to deliver during COVID? Nora, then coming to yourself, I'm going to ask all the other folks, so please forgive. Nora, thank you very much. Good to see you again. Support the work of CO3. Can I just start off by saying it's similar to what I said to NICVA earlier. I can only imagine what it is like to be a leader in the community and voluntary sector at the moment, because not only do you have to juggle all that managers have to juggle, but you have that added built-in pressure of pressure that's on staff and volunteers. So my utmost respect to you and your organisation. Nora, I'm assuming that that CO3 is on a joint government and community sector forum. And I'm just wondering, I know you had spelled out there about the full cost recovery and the papers that are going forward to try and move that issue forward. Has there been any discussion about how full cost recovery is going to be implemented across all departments? Is there going to be an agreement that would be relevant for all departments, a one approach? And as well as that, I wanted to ask you, there's obviously going to be a new programme for government coming up. Has there been any work from the Joint Government and Community Sector Forum to bring forward full cost recovery in that programme for government? And the other thing I wanted to ask you, Nora, is there any report that we can look at that confirms just how much of public services are being delivered by the community and voluntary sector? Now, when I worked in community transport, for instance, you could turn around and say 77 million, at that stage, 77 million passenger trips were being delivered by TransLink. Massive amount of people. My community transport people at that stage were delivering 2 million passenger trips. So I could sort of see how much of the market that we were delivering upon. But when you start to think about how much of health and social care, community services that are being delivered, do we actually know how much public services? Because Northern Ireland, I feel, depends very heavily on our community and voluntary sector. But does that actually reflect in the amount of money that's being spent? And I doubt it is. So I'll leave all those. Sorry for all the questions there, folks, but I thought I would get them in all together. So Michelle, if you want to talk about your, the impacts, maybe Nora. Thank you.
Okay, Kelly, thank you. So we're still working through the whole financial impact of the pandemic, and I think it's going to take us at least this year to really understand, because, like Richard said, we've tightened our belts, we've reviewed lots and lots of different areas. We are trying our hardest to protect the frontline services that we deliver, and as I said, our income was reduced by approximately £1 million, and so we some of the initiatives did help in terms of the furlough scheme, but that was primarily used for retail staff. Obviously, my children's services staff needed to be still out there. Our children's house needed to be open. Our foster carers kept delivering. Our leaving care services. All of those people were still out and about and doing the work they needed to. We did avail of £4,500 towards PPE from the VCSE COVID Recovery Fund, so that's helped a wee bit towards the PPE cost. We prioritise spend on essential services to ensure children and families don't experience a reduction in the service they receive. However, that has meant, Nora referred to the engine room services, that's meant our support services have been reduced to ensure that essential services can continue to deliver. So like Richard talked about, we're trying to work to balance budget. It's the bit about we've shrunk things that we can, but as you know yourself, somebody else still has to do that piece of work. So you'll find people who are already running at 150 miles an hour now getting something else to do too. We've made a commitment to achieving reductions in our operating costs to protect essential services for this year. However, that will mean that the reinvestment of income is severely restricted and may lead to reductions in essential services as we move towards the end of this financial year. We're already having some conversations, some difficult conversations. Kelly, you know, when you're not full cost recovered, so if I've got public sector contract and it's 65-70%, I've got to find the 30% somewhere else, and if I can't find it, I can't deliver it. And that's the hardest thing, because especially when you work in an area with vulnerable children and the young people and their families. So the predicted shortfall in our voluntary funds will impact the organisation as we try to maintain our capability and capacity to work with children and families during a time of increasing need and complexity. You know, we're now at 18,000. If we'd had this conversation 2 weeks ago, I would have been telling you that we worked with 14,000 children and young people and their families last year. That's the sort of increase, the demand that we're seeing. We risk being unable to continue subsidising services contracted below the full cost recovery, and that could lead, as I said, to the inability to fulfil some contracts, which will lead to a loss of key services for vulnerable children and young people. So that's what we're doing. We won't know the huge impact. I did refer to you earlier, we did have to close our autism service. We'd had a history of just it being so underfunded. It was only 25% funded, and I just didn't have, and I know the need, and I personally and professionally know the need out there in relation to ASD, but I couldn't do that, and there's some other services that we're really going to have to look at going forward.
Yeah.
So it's hard.
It really is, yeah.
So, Kelly, thanks for your question. Yes, it does feel like more than 9 years. Yeah, I'll stick with the example maybe that I used in terms of counselling, and like this is a service that is offered, you know, in hospital settings across the trusts as well as other community settings. There's a perception, certainly at the service user patient end, that it's actually part of the holistic care package alongside the diagnostic and treatment pathways for patients. And then therefore when it reduces or disappears, all of a sudden then, you know, it's more apparent, you know, where it's funded from. So in terms of our specialist cancer care counselling, we would receive SLAs from 4 of the 5 health trusts for I think around 231 hours a week, of which 56 hours would be funded. That's about 25%. So therefore the impact for us, you know, was that we have to fund the balance from voluntary income, and therefore we were in a crisis. You know, March, April of last year, we did manage, you know, because I was keen that that's a service that needed to be prioritised. That it was down at capacity for about 75% for about 5 to 6 months, but we got it back up and running again. But there is a real need, I think, for that as an example on other services, you know, that is perceived to be core, to be mainstreamed, you know, and actually, you know, more value attributed to the service, you know, from statutory source. So yes, you know, we can, you know, and again, that 25% is not fully cost recovered. You know, that's a consistent theme. But yes, you know, we can cost what's required. Like pre-COVID, and this is off the top of my head, but certainly in the Belfast Trust and I think the Southern Trust, there were 13 and 20 week waiting times respectively for cancer patients who wanted to receive counselling. And our counselling is run with no cap because everyone's cancer journey is unique. So the sessions were uncapped. That did spike to almost, I think, over 45 weeks, you know, as a result of the, you know, the delay and waiting times therefore increased. Now, we have had some emergency funding via the Department of Health in the early part of this year to try and redress some of the waiting lists. But it is so important that we, you know, have the ability to build back and recover, you know, to pre-COVID levels that were distressed anyway. One other quick example as well is a driving service, you know, where we were driving about 1,000 cancer patients every year to chemo and radio sessions. Again, no aligned statutory funding source. Obviously, from an infection point of view, there was risk around that, but again, that is a service that is now at risk as we look at what's affordable going forward, you know, sort of post-pandemic. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah, but you know, the situation is distressed.
And can I just ask you then on that, on the transport side, you'll get me started, Richard. I'm a geek on transport. I take it then that you are covering the volunteers' costs, the 45p per mile, and no funding for that.
Yeah, so we fund that entirely from our voluntary income, and yes, further to Michelle's point earlier, volunteers are not free. You know, there is a huge amount of safeguarding, risk assessment, governance around that. And our contribution to the volunteer is to cover mileage. But it's a hugely vital service in terms of especially for people who come from more socially deprived backgrounds and who maybe have 5 weeks of radio. Bridgewater and need to get there every day and don't have access to transport. So I think it's just another example of a service that is not funded, but that has been relied upon, by the health service, in addition to the other provision that is made.
It's one of those hidden things, and Michelle be able to say, foster services and the amount of transport. Mm-hmm. But I can geek all day on transport, but I want to hear from Nora. Thank you, Nora, over to you.
Can I just remind members, and we're now under some time pressures, so if we could be as direct as possible, that would be great.
Yeah. So in relation to the question about the joint forum, Kelly, we're not members of the joint forum, but our chair, Anne-Marie McClure, is chair of CO3 and chair of the joint forum. So there is that communication link between the two. We did a response to the, I'm not sure if the joint forum did a response to the joint forum. That would be something that would need to clarify and come back to you on. We did a response to the programme for government, and to be honest, and it feels like a lifetime ago now, but off the top of my head, it was a very high level document. So there was quite a lot of detail missing from it. So it probably raised more questions than the opportunity to offer any real response to. And those were the two key points that we had raised at the time, just the absence of detail and no ownership of outcomes as well. And the outcomes, again, were very loose and difficult to pin down. And then the third question around the amount of money that was being paid or being allocated to the sector through public procurement. It's a really good question. I don't have the answer to you or for you. I do know that I think there's something like £3 billion that's allocated annually through public procurement on spending. But what that actual breakdown is for our sector specifically, I don't know, and I'm not even sure how we would go about trying to find that, but it's certainly something that I can do a wee bit more digging on, or if you can on our behalf, right?
Sorry, thank you, Chair. No, that's why I was asking, because we do have an issue where if we are going to respect the work of the community and voluntary sector, we need to know just how much, and we can't ignore that anymore, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you. I have then one more member to come in. If we could bring Karen in, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I will be quick. I know coming in last again, it is covered, mostly is covered, and we're under pressure for time, but thank you, Nora, Michelle and Richard, and I'm not going to go over you would have heard my earlier contributions, and that stands to yourselves. Once again, I want to thank you and commend everybody working within your organisations for the invaluable work. Lucky enough, I have over being a community and voluntary worker, but also in this role, I have seen it firsthand and been involved with many of your organisations. Barnardo's, I was very lucky that over the time being in the Education Committee, I learnt a lot more in relation to the work and valuable work that you do, and the work that Michelle that you do here in my community in Derry. And it has been a really difficult time. Coming out of this, it is about picking up those children and families who have suffered greatly, particularly over this past year, and we should be doing everything we can to support. And I think going into this pandemic, we were bidding for funds and all the rest, and once we got money, it became clear the grey areas that existed for some of your organisations across different departments and jurisdictions and things like that there. So hopefully there's a lot of learning there for us coming out of this. Michelle, see just, and I'll ask in a group maybe because of time and I'll come back, but for yourself, I know you touched there because I was going to ask Was there education funding? I know you said there is now, but was there education COVID emergency funding, or did the Department of Economy support the shops in terms of the charity shops? And I know that goes across also for Cancer Focus and many other charities. For yourself, Richard, welcome to the post. I have been very lucky involved with the Pink Ladies Cancer Support Group here in Derry for many years, so we'll be aware of how difficult it is for charities like yourself. And just listening to yourself and Kelly talk there, the hidden cost of cancer was always something that we worked on and championed and continued to do. When you're talking about transport not funding, that was something that the group here provides and would have provided in the past. We would have people from Derry travelling to Belfast, having to stay, all those costs that your charities and ours come on behind and support. But again, I think a question for yourself I wanted to ask was, did health and is health providing COVID emergency funding also for cancer charities? I know you've been lucky enough there in terms of DFC funding, but is health also contributing? That's the only two questions I have. Michelle and Richard, if you could come on.
Okay, thank you, Karen, and thank you for your kind words and your support always. Very, very welcome. In relation to support from other government departments, the way it worked was that the departments gave us the assurance that we didn't have to put staff on furlough, so they covered the cost of the contracts that we already had. We still had to find the bits of the contract that isn't paid for. So for example, in education, in schools counselling, there's parts of the contracts are that where somebody's off sick, that's not covered, and we have to pay them for somebody else coming in. What we did with schools counselling was fantastic, was we were able to get everybody online, and then as schools started to open up again and feel more confident, we've been able to get our counsellors back in really quickly, especially in our special schools. It would be great if we could see, if we could see quickly the pilot for schools counselling being rolled out. That would be even better. But no, they covered. They gave us letters of assurance to cover the contracted costs, so we didn't have to furlough those frontline staff. Health did the same. So that was at departmental level, and with communities, with the contracts we had for neighbourhood renewal and with supporting people, we were able to avail of some additional supporting people funds, capital costs that will really help, for example, at our leave and care service, because obviously we needed a bit more space with all the regulations around social distancing.
Okay,
With economy, the other bit was economy. We were able to avail of some funding for the shops. Yeah. Unfortunately, we have had to close some of our shops. You may have seen that. We've had to reduce the number of shops, and we'll review that over the next while when we see how things develop.
Thank you, Michelle. Richard?
Karen, thanks for your very kind words and your support of the sector on behalf of ourselves and colleagues. We were fortunate that we did get some Department of Health emergency funding for what was the last quarter of the previous financial year. There was, I think, some money set aside specifically for cancer charities from, I think, money that maybe came from Westminster. It was a very small amount of money, but we were able to access that in order to fund some of our creative therapies, our counselling work, and really the practical support of patients between January and March to the end of the previous financial year. The department have also announced that there has been, I think, nearly 11 million set aside into a cancer charity support fund, which is very welcome. It went live on Monday of this week, and it's the intermediary. I think it's been administered by the Community Foundation in Northern Ireland. So that will go some way as well to assisting cancer organisations like ourselves to have the opportunity to apply and to help to try and build back and recover some of the services. So we'll certainly be making an application to that.
That's great, thank you, Richard and Michelle. And I suppose thankfully, the DFC minister acted very quickly along with officials and got money out. but we very quickly went into a complete lockdown. So there is a lot of lessons there to be learnt, and I hope that we do learn them, because as Nora has said, the pressures was there beforehand, but COVID has shone a spotlight on it, and we do need to be working closer together across the government departments to make sure that, because you are the ones that are providing the vital services, and you can't stop. When you look at cancer, it's life or death, and it's not just the person, it's the family, and I know that's across many of the other organisations as well. So I just hope that we do take the learning from this, and we do put it into place, and we do the co-design properly going forward, and be able to support one another. Just want to say it's sorry to hear that some of the shops have closed and there's redundancies, and I really do hope, I know you all work that hard, you will come back bigger and better, but we need the support just to do that. So thank you all for coming along today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Karen, and then can I then just finish by thanking yourself, Nora, and Michelle and Richard for your time today. If there has been any questions or anything further that we can do as a committee following this briefing today, Nora, please do get in contact with us if there's further information that needs sought. I know we're under now a major time pressure to move on, but I just want to say, can you please pass on behalf of this committee our great appreciation to all within your sector and everything that you've been doing for many, many years, and just this committee's support in going forward, and how we shape that going forward for your sector. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. All right, can we bring all members then into the spotlight? Members, I'm going to now do just a little bit of speed reading. We're going to move on to tabled items, which is SL1 Private Rented Sector Registered Rents Increase Order 2021. We've been asked by the Department to consider this SL1 today at our meeting, and it can be found, to ensure timescales are met, it can be found in your table papers. The proposed rule would allow for an increase of 1.5% to rents of protected and statutory tenancies for those properties that meet the housing fitness standard. This would represent an average weekly increase of £1.08. A protected tenancy is a tenancy controlled by the rent officer for Northern Ireland. In most cases, this means the present tenant is the person who is granted the tenancy. A statutory tenancy is a tenancy where the original tenant has died and a tenancy has transferred to the tenant's successor, for example, their spouse or sibling. A protected or statutory tenancy offers the most security against eviction, and only under circumstances by application to the courts can a tenant be evicted. Can I ask members, have they any comments? Are they content for the Department to proceed to make the rule? Content? Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to agenda item 9, which is correspondence. You'll find the memo at page 97. Can I just draw your attention to one item, and that's at page 99, which is a letter from Dolores Kelly, MLA, in relation to funding for Women's Aid Refuges. This came up at the all-party group that I chair, the APG, on Women, Peace and Security 1325. So I'd asked her to send it through to ourselves, because this is something that we need to look at the greater sort of housing strategy going forward. Are members content that we write to the Minister in support of the call for more funding?
Agreed.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I also wanted, another one, page 201, if I can draw your attention there, and it's the correspondence regarding the forecast outcome data provided by the Department of Finance. Can I ask members, if you wish to write to the Department, to query the rationale for any resource or capital end-of-year surges as advised by the Finance Committee, or are they content with what officials covered earlier? Officials, I think we need to write to the Department on that. I don't think we got a full explanation. Not that it was the officials' fault, because they maybe didn't have all of that information. Members agreed with that?
Agreed.
Okay, I'm going to ask if any other members anything on correspondence they wish to bring up. No? No, okay, then we'll move on to agenda item 10. That is our forward work programme. Next week's meeting we will be briefed by the Council for the Homeless, Co-Ownership and the National Insulation Association of Ireland, and also by the Department on Neighbourhood Renewal. Members were also made aware yesterday that the Minister is available to brief on welfare reform mitigations at next week's meeting. To enable this to happen, the meeting will have to commence at 9 a.m. As the Minister has an existing diary commitments at 9:30. 30 minutes I don't think is nowhere near long enough to discuss anything to do with welfare reform mitigations, but we are where we are. So can I ask members, are they content for the Minister to brief and the meeting to start at 9 a.m. next week?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I know it's not long enough. It's nowhere near long enough. But that is what we've been offered. Yeah, I think we need to discuss this at some stage, and we'll discuss it next week about just the length of time we're getting briefings for. And I know there's executive on a Thursday and things like that, but I think that's something we need to go back to our own parties about, that maybe looking at executive meetings having to be shuffled about a bit to allow the committees on a Thursday morning to get full access to their ministers, because I know that has been a major issue for us. Are members content with that? And we'll discuss that next week, maybe after the briefing, and we'll move on to agenda item 11. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Agenda item 11 is AOB. Any other business at this stage members want to bring up that we haven't already covered? No? Can we move on? Oh, sorry, Kelly, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Paula, I take your advice on this one. Obviously, we went through the consideration stage of the licensing and regulation of clubs the other day. There has been questions that were raised during the debate and have since actually been raised on clarification points. I'm just wondering, can we ask for those still through the committee, or should we take those directly through the department as individual MLAs?
Hold on, two texts. We'll just go to Janice.
I had an email just this morning from Claire McCanny in the Bill office that any further questions direct to her in the first instance.
Okay, so Janice has said any further questions direct to Claire McCanny in the Bill's office in the first instance. Does that clear that up for you, Kelly? I mean, yeah, okay. Because it's now left the committee, it's no longer with the committee. It's now in the Bill's office. All right, members, can we move on then to agenda item 12? That is date, time and location of our next meeting. Our next meeting will take place next Thursday, the 17th of June here in room 29 with the starting time of 9 a.m. You'll all be very glad about that. So thank you, members. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.